Well, welcome to my Track B Talk, my one audience member. So I'm just going to talk kind of briefly about the divide we have between the back end and the front end and how we can try to bridge that with some of our current tooling. So I'm Jonathan Martin. I work at the Big Nerd Branch in our front end and Rails development team. I teach our front end course. So if you happen to be in that Atlanta area, you can check us out. You can also follow me on Twitter @Nibbler. So I'm going to talk about something we deal with every day, that is people. And specifically, as front-end developers, we deal with back-end people. So that's great, but very often they're a little bit too irrational for our taste because we have a very specific workflow of how we like to work. So when we have to work on a full-stack team kind of environment, we have to pick some different strategies for how we're going to cope with our back-end friends. The first strategy we could pick is we could just try to survive through it. And typically that means anytime we need to do some PRs or something, one developer on it, keep them separated. Don't let them get anywhere near each other. Kind of like matter and antimatter reacting. So that collaboration strategy of steer clear is pretty much what most people go with. When it comes to tooling, deciding what tools to pick if you're going to collaborate with Rails and front end, it's typically whoever got to the code base first. And this is something that's very common and typically makes up the bulk of front-end, back-end teams. So the solution we want is we want to be able to thrive. We want to be able to take our front-end and back-end and make them thrive together like an Oreo. I talk about an Oreo just because we all know that the cookie part of an Oreo is just the presentation, and the sustaining white stuff that's hidden or encapsulated inside for the consumer is the important part, at least until the cookie contents are requested by the digestive tract. So with that little analogy, we want to treat our back-end fellow members like that Oreo cream. So too often we try too hard to mix together the front end and back end and try to get everyone on the same level, try to get them all educated the same like an Oreo truffle. We don't want to do that. We want to keep our separation of concerns. We want to keep the people who are experts in the front end and keep the experts who are experts in back end. But we need to find a good way to get us interoperating. So the first way we could try to do that is by trying to keep the two completely separate. Have an entirely separate repo for your front end part of the app, kind of like an iPhone client. The iPhone client isn't developed along with the server code. It's developed in isolation. So you could do the same thing. Just pretend that your front end client is a client and have it consume the back end. So that's one way we can do it. And this is a really great strategy to take if we have the time and resources to do it. But unfortunately, a lot of times, we don't have either. If you're in a hackathon of some sort, this especially comes up where you'd like to split off the two, but you have so little time to begin with that you don't have time to split off the two, make the separate repos, configure all the CSRF tokens and whatnot that come with a Rails-based API. So unfortunately, that's not always our leisure. So there are some strategies we can follow and some tooling we can pick from the go to make sure that the front-end developers don't go insane working with back-end developers and vice versa. So thankfully, we have some people who've already put together some really cool tools, and we can rely on their smarts to get started. So one strategy would be to just push through this with a front-end developer, just make it work, would be kind of our ideology for doing that. So here's one approach to doing it, taste-driven development, which means we're going to test the two parts, the front end and the back end. We're going to develop those and test them in isolation, and then come back frequently with pairing and deployment to do those together. So when we're working in the same Git repo, because we've made the assumption that we're going to develop our Rails and front end in the same repo, we can take one strategy where we educate the back-end developers in all of the ways of the front end and how to do those sorts of things, and how to name their CSS classes, and where to put their CSS. So that's one way. And that might work until we go to do the reverse and try to tell the front-end developers how they need to code, how they need to work with the APIs, how they should organize their CSS to best work with the Rails asset pipeline. So after going through some of that trauma, we might be tempted to instead do the don't share ideology, where we try to split our concerns completely and give front-end developers their domain of just the front end and tell them follow Rails conventions. Except we can't follow Rails conventions. Rails, unfortunately, gives us poor front-end conventions on occasion. So to prevent insanity, I'm going to go through just a bucket list of some ways that we at Big Nerd Ranch have found make this a little bit easier to work with between the front end and back end. So now I move to just a live coding demo. And let's see if I can get the screens working here. All right, so here I have an end result. This is just a project we did recently for an internal hackathon. Many of you may recognize this as dashing, which is put out by Shopify. So as part of the Clashing project, we wanted to use Shopify, but of course we took it upon ourselves to rewrite it in Ember because none of us wanted to write Batman code. So in the process, it made for a really interesting experiment because we had 2 backend developers, another backend developer who apparently wrote Go, and 1 front-end developer. And that consistently changed through the period of the hackathon because we had one jump on and off from front-end to back-end. So it was an interesting consistency to work with, and we had to make sure, working at that fast pace, that we didn't get in each other's way. So one of the ways we did that was when we started out with the Rails app, we wanted to make sure that we had a conventional Rails app to begin with. But when it came to assets of any sort, we wanted to let the front-end team have their domain. So the first thing we did is we used Bower. Now, Bower obviously is, for the front end, a must tool to make sure you aren't just copy-pasting scripts from off the internet and putting it in your repo. So with Rails, we would typically pull in some gems in the gem file. If we wanted to use Backbone, we might pull in that helper gem. If we wanted to use underscore, Bootstrap, jQuery, the list goes on and on. Typically, if you're developing in Rails, you're going to pull in a separate gem. But the problem is these gems are often behind the Bower version or whatever version is on GitHub. It also doesn't really handle assets very well. Gems are meant for packaging Ruby code, not so much for packaging and managing assets. So what we'd like to do is pull Bower, which gives us a really nice way of specifying dependencies for front-end developers. And we'd like to be able to use that in the asset pipeline. So it's actually not all that difficult to set up, but there are some kinks to work out. So first, in our gem file, we want to make sure that we're using the Bower Rails gem. So Bower Rails is just a little gem that can handle some of the asset loading for us. It also provides some rake tasks, but we actually don't want to use the rake tasks because front-end developers are going to want to use the Bower install command. They don't want to use rake bower:install. So that's the first part. Second, we want to define those dependencies in our bower.json. Now, bower.json, if you're using the rake task, is actually going to be defined for you under vendor assets, possibly under components, depending on where you change the path. And we don't want this. We want just our plain bower.json and to put it up here in the home directory. So we'll move it up here, define your dependencies as we're used to. Here's where we get into some interesting Rails niches. Notice I'm using jQuery here, and actually we could use jQuery UJS, which is also available on Bower. But there's going to be some conflicts. If you've already got the jQuery gem in your gem file, which is almost always the case, then you're going to have script conflicts because they have the same name. And depending on how the rules work, one is going to win out over the other. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we don't have the jQuery gem in here at all. Now, thankfully, in Rails 4, this was not a required dependency, so it's easy to pull this out. Now, as we can see here, I've already taken jQuery out. And the way you can just test some of this stuff is start up your server, check in Chrome, and see what sources you already have. Try to get it to the point, before you convert over to Bower, try to get it to the point where you have no assets at all. No CSS, no JavaScript, etc. You want to get to the point where you don't have any of that there, so you can start pulling it into Bower and make sure you don't have any conflicts. So once we pulled out jQuery, and possibly we've pulled in jQuery UJS, you can pull in your other stuff. You can pull in handlebars in this case. I was also using Emblem. Emblem is a template language for Ember that just compiles down to handlebars. So Emblem is kind of tricky because there is a gem for it, because if you want to have efficient Emblem templates, you actually do want to precompile them, kind of like you might precompile a handlebars template for production. That's a production step. That's not something you just want to handle in the browser. So this is one of those situations where we did have to use a gem. So if you look at our gem file, we actually have an emblem-rails gem in here. Now, in this case, I actually had to go off on a fork because I wanted to make it so it would just use whatever Bower version of Ember we had. Because if you try to use Emblem Rails, the canonical version at least, it'll automatically pull in Ember. It'll automatically pull in Ember data, handlebars, etc. All these gems that we don't want. We just want the Emblem precompiler, and we want it to use our Bower JavaScript files. So, but the rest of them in Bower JSON are straightforward. We've just got D3 and a few other libraries that are used by dashing. So the last thing we need to do is we need to go into config, go to application, and here Rails gives us a nice way to tell it where to find some more assets. So this is just one line. We're telling it to include this vendor assets components. Now that's where our Bower stuff is going to be installed. Now recall with Bower, we need to tell it where that components directory is. So if I show the hidden files, you can see we have a Bower RC file here. If we look in that, I've just told it whenever it installs, instead of putting it under Bower components, put it under vendor/assets/components. And this is important. It doesn't have to be that exact directory, but vendor assets is the conventional place to put third-party libraries in a Rails app. So you're meeting that one convention. But on the other hand, with Bower, the convention is to put it under some directory called components. So this is kind of a trade-off between the two. So just make sure you define that Bower RC file, put in that new directory. You can pick whatever directory you want so long as it's consistent. Finally, we go up to our app assets. The cool thing is that Bower Rails will automatically expose all of our Bower dependencies with these simple require paths. So if I go up here, for example, I'm going to go to application.js. Here at the very top, I've got my require jQuery, require handlebars, and require Ember. I didn't have to put in the full path to that Bower component. Typically, for something like Ember, you'd have to put in require, for example, ember/dist/ember.min.js. Well, we don't want to do that. We just want our paths to look exactly the same as they were when they were a Ruby gem. And this is really easy to do thanks to Bower Rails. So we can require in our dependencies here. So the asset pipeline, you'll notice, is something we want to continue to embrace since we're going with a Rails front-end kind of mix. And thankfully, now that we've split out these Ruby gems, instead we're using Bower, it's actually pretty easy to do. So the last part we'll get into when dealing with Bower is some of these deployment issues, and that's probably where the bulk of the rest of the talk is. So let's go back. Now you'll also notice back in the gem file, I had another file in there. Because we're letting front-end developers take control of all the assets, one gem I like to use is called quiet_assets, and that basically gets rid of all asset requests that are made to the Rails server. It takes them out of your log, because at this point, you don't care where the assets are coming from in Rails. You just know they're coming from Bower. You want to let the front-end team handle that. That can make it a little bit easier to split your domains. The other thing to keep in mind is that you want to script all these sorts of things. So as we see, when you're dealing with Ember, or when you're dealing with deployment to Heroku and you're using Bower, you can run into all kinds of issues. So you want to write those as bin scripts to make sure that your front-end and Rails developers are doing the same thing. So when you try to use Node with your Rails projects, for example, if you're trying to use it for doing any kind of builds, maybe you decide that the asset pipeline isn't going to meet your needs, or it's maybe a little bit too cumbersome. You can actually use Node modules in it, but as we'll see, it can be a little bit tricky to deploy it. So if you're going to just stick with the asset pipeline, which is what we're doing in this particular project because we had time constraints, make sure that you go wholeheartedly with Bower. If you try to drop a few things under vendor assets, you're going to get a beating from the front-end team because it's hard to find. We like, front-end developers, we like to know explicitly where our dependencies are coming from. So for deploying to Heroku, you can run into some issues. First of all, this is primarily a Rails app, but it has a Node basis, which means when we deploy it up to Heroku, we can't just deploy it as a Rails app. We actually have to deploy it as a multi-build pack app. So let's go back to that code. So you'll notice when I had the hidden files exposed here, I have this .buildpacks file. This is something that Heroku provides to us that lets us define explicitly what kind of application we're using and what packages that we want to use to build it. So here, for example, I've listed 2 packages. First, I've listed that I want to use Node.js as my first build pack, and then I want to use the standard Ruby one. This second line is what Heroku automatically picks for us when we're deploying. The first one, we have to give explicitly. So once we've defined those build packs, then we just need to do some basic Heroku configuration. We need to remove the current build pack. If you do a Heroku env, you'll see that the current build pack is probably set to Ruby, and you don't want that. You want to get rid of that and instead push it with this, and it'll realize that it's a multi-pack and automatically do what it's supposed to. But when we push it up, it needs to know what to do with that package. So one way we can do that is by creating a node package file. So here I've got package.json. I've just defined a few basic parameters. Notably, I've set dev dependencies. Dev dependencies, I've said that to build this project anywhere, you've got to have Bower. Now, most users are going to have Bower installed globally through node modules, but when we're deploying to the server is not going to have Bower installed. So we need to define the dev dependency. The other thing we need to do is define one of these post-install scripts. So this tells Heroku, or even locally if you're using npm install, it says that after you've installed these packages, run this script. So in this case, we've told it to run the Bower bin command and call install on it. So once it calls install, it'll finally pull in our bower.json dependencies for us so that the server can actually run. From there, the asset pipeline kicks in, and we'll get some minification in the second part of the build step. The second part of the build step, which is after npm is run, Ruby finally kicks in. Now, Ruby does a pre-compilation step. It'll actually minify and concatenate all of our assets, put hashes on them. So the neat thing about using Bower Rails is that we don't have to worry about Bower Rails interfering with any of that. All Bower Rails does for us is help us automatically get these dependencies, these JavaScript packages. Once we have them, Rails takes over, and we get all the same minification benefits, we get the hash codes, etc. So you don't have to make a total departure from the good things that the asset pipeline provides for us, but you can get the benefits at the same time of using it. Sit back. Just one quick note, watch the name of that build pack. If it's not pluralized, you may find that you keep pushing and it doesn't do anything. So that's all that I have. I have some example repos up if you're interested that show basically how you could do this from start, just a basic boilerplate getting started. So I found this to be useful. We've used it on a couple projects and it seems to be working well. So that's all.